Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the nice global conclave from the labs of the beautiful Himalayas, where the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is located. The think tank was established in the month of February in the year 2016. It undertakes independent research in the field of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and development. NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Security and Strategic Studies. The institute focuses on 8 research topics: climate change and energy, global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, refugee and migration, China's Belt and Road Initiative.
So we'll start again. Just there is some short technical glitch. Just 2 minutes, sir.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the nice global conclave from the labs of the beautiful Himalayas, where the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is located. The think tank was established in the month of February in the year 2016. It undertakes independent research in the field of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and development. NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Security and Strategic Studies. The institute focuses on 8 research topics: climate change and energy, global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, refugee and migration, China's Belt and Road Initiative, border and transboundary water politics, Indo-Pacific affairs, disaster management, and international economy and development. Previously, NICE has had the opportunity to host distinguished speakers from all around the globe.
It was a great pleasure inviting me to speak here at NICE.
It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you.
Well, thank you anyway, and I certainly admire the work that you're doing.
I'm very happy to be with you all.
NICE Global Conclave is the flagship event of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. The theme of the 3-day conference is Connecting Nepal to the World, with the aim to bring the leaders, diplomats, business leaders, and scholars from all around the globe. The objective of the conclave is to introduce Nepal to the world and at the same time update the Nepalese policymakers and experts about the fast-changing geopolitics, which will help Nepal reshape its foreign policy to achieve its national goals. This is the 7th session of the conference, and to chair and moderate this session, it's a real pleasure to have Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan here with us. Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan is the Director General of the National Maritime Foundation, New Delhi. He has been the Principal Evaluator of the Navy's Battle Tactics, the Head of Naval Training Team at the Defense Service Staff College, and the Principal Director of Naval Operations. As a Vice Admiral, he has been Chief of Staff of the Western Naval Command, and he has been commended 3 times by the President of India for sustained distinguished service. Apart from being on the visiting faculty of the higher command establishments of all 3 India's defense services, as also tri-service establishment such as the College of Defense Management, Hyderabad, and the National Defense College, New Delhi. He has also been advising the government through his interaction with the integrated headquarters of the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of External Affairs, the National Security Council Secretariat, and the Joint Intelligence Committee. Without any further ado, I request the chair to take over.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jaiswal, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me very great pleasure and a sense of abiding honor to be able to chair this session with 6 absolutely scintillating luminaries from across the world. So allow me to welcome each of them. I'm going to lay down a few quick ground rules. We are tight for time always, even before we begin. So I think if each Satu, if each of us can sort of stay with, if each of the panelists can stay with about 7 minutes of dilation, and definitely at the 8th minute, I'm going to pop up and make some polite request for you to wind it up. Then we will have sufficient time, for me to give some overview, and much more importantly for the audience to ask questions and answers. So while I load a preliminary sort of presentation of mine, which will, I hope, set the tone for this session, and it won't take very long, I promise. The questions that will need to be answered by us, and I'm hoping that that these will indeed be answered today, are that the Indo-Pacific ought not in and of itself to be considered to be a strategy, but rather a strategic geography. And within this strategic geography, should we pursue inclusive, cooperative, collaborative strategies, or should we opt for competitive, confrontational, and conflictual ones, is a central question, of course, that we must try in this session to answer. In this business of strategic geography, how on earth does it differ from real geography? So let me quickly say that in the process of discussing this business of strategic geography, let's take a map or a chart which depicts real geography. And if you put on that a series of latitudes and longitudes and make points and then join them up. And then in the area that is so bounded, you concentrate your grand strategy. Then the area that you have so bounded will be your strategic geography. And if you look at our geography, if you look at the Indo-Pacific as a geography, you will see that the Indo-Pacific constructs of ASEAN, Japan, France, Germany, and the EU pretty much coincide with that of India, in that they include the entire region shaped by the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And it's true that the the constructs of Australia and the USA do not presently go west of India, but there's increasing evidence of strategic convergence between all of them. And by that, we don't only mean shared interests, but a shared sense of where we need to go, what is valuable, and so on and so forth. So what should India, for example, without trying to steal any thunder from Abhijit, has its desired end state as the economic, material, and societal well-being of the people of India, and we could substitute that for any other nation state as well instead of India. And then we've got a statement of policy, which in our case would be Sigur, which is an outreach, both diplomatic and economic and military across the region itself. What is our basic interest of all of us? It's freedom from threats arising in the sea or through the sea or from the sea. And these threats could be either man-made, they could be natural, they could be combinations. And I think that our interlocutors would in fact be discussing these issues. Then from there, we cascade down from interest, we cascade down to the objectives. And I would suggest that we would look for the following objectives: respect for territorial integrity, sovereignty, stability involving peace and prosperity, the creation, the development and sustenance of a regional blue economy that is resilient against adverse maritime impacts of climate change, the preservation, the promotion, the protection of overall regional offshore infrastructure and maritime resources, both within national jurisdictions and outside of them, the promotion, the protection, the safety of overseas trade, the international shipping lanes, and of course the ports that constitute the modes of these, support to marine and scientific research, including that in the Arctic and the Antarctic. So if those are going to be our kind of objectives, then what kinds of strategies ought we to be adopting? And I would suggest that perhaps this slide might help. Can we develop a regional grand strategy characterized by comity between nations, characterized by holistic security leading to durable peace, pluralism and inclusivity, cooperation and coexistence, openness, that is transparency of intent and action, the primacy of dialogue, the promotion of democracy, and a consensually derived and internationally accepted rules-based order. Now, when we look at our region from the security perspective, of course, we have to take into account risk, and we find that we have perhaps 7 major risks, one for each day of the week. And in this listing of risks, we have China, unfortunately, figuring at least not, if not as a threat, but certainly as a risk factor, and we hope to be able to address that quite squarely. To do that, I have, as I mentioned earlier, Satu Limaye, who is the Vice President and Director of the East-West Center in Washington, where he's going to talk to us about 7 continuities and 4 contests that are driving the direction of change in the Indo-Pacific. We've got Dr. Deepa Ollapally, who's a research professor and associate director in the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at the George Washington University. We've got Abhijit Singh, who's an extremely well-known and deeply respected maritime analyst. He is the head of the Maritime Policy Initiative at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. And he will talk to us about the evolution of India's Indo-Pacific vision and the Quad strategy. Then we will be following that up by Dr. Amit Gupta, who is an associate professor at the Department of International Security Studies at the United States Air Force War College, United States Air Force Air War College. He will talk to us and offer us some thoughts on some workable avenues for the Quad. Dr. Aparna Pande is our penultimate panelist. She's the director of initiative of on the future of India and South Asia at the Hudson Institute, and will be addressing the issue of how the USA's Indo-Pacific strategy actually fits into its grand strategy and where India-US relations tie into that. And our last, but certainly not the least, speaker or panelist for today is Professor Jeffrey S. Payne, who is an old friend and colleague of mine. And he is the manager of academic affairs in the Near East and South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, better known as NISA. And he will draw our attention to the trend lines in US Indo-Pacific security cooperation and how partnerships beyond the Quad will assist US aims in its priority theater. So without any further ado, I get to mention the thrust line of Dr. Ollapally, I think. So let me quickly hasten to put that in as well. And she's going to talk to us about how the Quad poses some dilemmas for India's broader strategy and what its likely options are going forward. Now, that's a very rich fare and a rich feast that I'm about to lay before our audience. You have the chefs of the intellectual world available to you. Please, ladies and gentlemen, ask them hard questions. They are done with answering easy questions all over the world, and they are the best place to answer the tough, the difficult, the awkward questions. So please do that, and without any further ado, let me hand over the floor and the proceedings to Dr. Satu Limaye, another old and valued friend. Satu, you have 7 minutes and they start now.
Well, thank you, Vice Admiral Chauhan, and of course to Dr. Deswal and the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation. I thank you for the invitation. And of course, greetings and good wishes to my fellow panelists on this panel. Look, I have 7 minutes. Let me just lay out what I think are US continuities and where they sit as I speak to you today. First, we've had a 25-year turn towards the Indo-Pacific. Started in 2001 with the so-called concept of the East Asian littoral, and I quote, running from the Sea of Japan to the Bay of Bengal. That has gone to the other side of India now to encompass all of India. But I will just flag that I believe that we may be at the peak concept of the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific. Second, I think you are well aware that this great power competition over the last 22 plus years has been building. It has been evolutionary. It has now risen to more intensity. It's unlikely to change. There's both public, bipartisan, and a rough consensus in the US about great power competition, but it is not an uncontested consensus about great power competition. And I would refer you all to Senator Bernie Sanders' piece in Foreign Affairs this week on questioning whether a Cold War type competition is the right strategy for clearly some of China's quite unwelcome behaviors. The third continuity and question is the commitment of the United States to shift resources and attention to Asia. My own view of this in watching our defense and USAID and diplomatic outlays is there is a definite shift in progress. And as you well know, the last Defense Department report characterized the Indo-Pacific as the priority theater for the department. That does not necessarily mean that is a whole of government consensus about that, but it certainly means that there is in progress a shift in resources and attention. I think that continuity will continue. Fourth, I think there is an ongoing commitment in the part of the US to view Asia as part of its key interests in the commercial space. But I think the fundamental approaches of the US towards garnering the benefits of that commercial space are changing quite structurally and remain evolving. Examples, less interest in large multilateral and bilateral free trade arrangements, huge issues related to decoupling and technology controls, a lot of emphasis on supply chain risk and resilience. So how that bears on the way in which we access commercial opportunities, trade, investment, and other things are, I think, an ongoing process, though that the core continuity of access to the region is unchanged in our policies for about 200 years. Fifth, the continuity of privileging alliances and partnerships is intensifying rather than declining. And I make the argument that, in fact, notwithstanding, yeah, there are some complexities, but overall, the trajectory of US alliances and partnerships has improved over the last 20 plus years, has become more solid, more deep, more structural, and more integrated into American strategy. Sixth, I think there is a continued commitment to a multilateral presence in the region, primarily to keep the US in, promote US interests and values, not to cede the region to others, and help shape the geostrategic, geoeconomic, and geo-value environment. However, the fraying of ASEAN, the fraying of the globalization picture, most dominantly in terms of APEC, has created a new context for multilateralism. And my colleagues on the panel, I understand, will speak about Quad more deeply, but I would flag that Quad is a particular element in which you can see this frayed multilateralism being recalibrated. And so we'll just have to see how ASEAN-led multilateralism fares within this context of frayed regional multilateralism. Seventh and final continuity is American commitment to human rights and democracy in the region. I do not believe or see in my work with the Congress and others that this has changed in any fundamental way. As I would say, while there is a continuity and consistency and emphasis on human rights and democracy seen most recently in the cases of Myanmar and Thailand in the region, of course, the implementation will be tailored in practice, as it always is for any country. And I hardly see that as a fundamental shift, just a way in which it's calibrated to other interests and policies, as it always has been. So there's no fundamental change. So what does that mean for the regional structural environment, if that's the US continuities and policies? I think I have identified in writing before, and I'll just reiterate and just flag them. in my last 2 minutes. The 4 contests that I see in the region, there are 4 contests in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, these bleed into global affairs, but one is over power, one is over order. When I say order, I mean rules, norms, and institutions. The third contest is about relationships, and the final one is about a contest of narratives. My own 2 points about these contests is they are continually evolving because the international structure and international system is dynamic, evolving. But these 4 fundamental contests are being played out in a rather extraordinarily dynamic way. And I would flag 2 elements of them. First, that China and the US-China dynamic is a dominant and driving element of these contests, but by no means the only element. And sometimes we forget that while we're paying attention to the US-China dynamic and the balance of power, which is fundamental, and I'm not trying to diminish its importance, but I'm simply suggesting just below that, there's a Sino-Indian balance of power contest, Japan-China balance of power contest, a ROK Japan balance of power context, and this bleeds into the other contests as well, lesser or greater, depending on the issue at hand. So let me just conclude by saying that I think there are fundamental continuities in US policy. I think each of them is being buffeted by a set of very complex dynamics, and that the 4 structural contests in the Indo-Pacific are now playing their way out in an even more dynamic and difficult to predict way, given the COVID pandemic. I thank you for your time, Vice Admiral, and I hope I have followed your orders, sir, by sticking to the time allotted. You're on mute, sir.
Thank you. Normally people pay me money to do that. But I do want to say thank you for staying with the time, for presenting us with such a brilliant and yet succinct overview of the 4 continuities and the 7 contestations that you see lying within the Indo-Pacific. And without any further ado, let me hand over the baton now to Dr. Deepa Ollapally. Ma'am, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Vice Admiral Chauhan. Thank you, and a special thanks to Dr. Jaiswal for the invitation. It seems like a terrific conclave that you've put together. Of course, Satu, who's a good friend, is always a hard act to follow, but thank you for laying it out so comprehensively. And so let me zone in a little bit more on the Quad that you just mentioned, and look at the way in which India is shaping a Quad strategy, what the drivers are and what the implications are. And I think what I want to say is the implications from the direction it's taking, it does produce a number of dilemmas that I think that I will lay out. But essentially, what I want to do is to start by laying out 3 main drivers for the way in which it's being shaped in India. One, what I call a short-term driver, another a medium term, and another one a longer term. So let me start with that. Of course, the fact that India is shaping a more explicit Quad strategy is only becoming clearer in recent years. And so right now, what I think is happening is that the drivers that I'm going to lay out has led India toward a sharper and stronger commitment to Quad, and by extension, the kind of vision and future it sees for its own Indo-Pacific approach. So I want to say one aside that I think we are in a little bit of danger of overselling the Quad. Because usually it has been in the past underselling. I think we have to be careful not to overselling it. All right, so what do I see as the 3 drivers for India's acceleration and deepening of its move into the Quad? The first driver is an immediate proximate driver. And here I think it has to do with the rapid deterioration of relations with China on the continental side, on the Himalayan borders, and the need for a bolder response. As we know, the continental border face-offs that India has had, and in recent years been speeding up on that, India faces disadvantages logistically and militarily. And of course, we have many more experts than myself on the military and naval aspects, but so mine will be more of a political take on this. In contrast to its disadvantages on the continental side, of course, India has clear advantages of location and logistics in the Indian Ocean region. And so I think the attraction of a maritime hedge for strategic leverage against China has become much stronger. And the Indo-Pacific construct under which the Quad operates then becomes strategically critical for reasons to do with land border, not maritime issues. That's a proximate immediate driver. The second driver I see for the Quad strategy is a medium-term driver, which is India's need to shore up mechanisms that can demonstrate its commitment and presence in the Indo-Pacific, because it is losing this ability and credibility through economic means. It's filling a gap in an economic context. Now, India's Look East, Act East policy were fundamentally led by economics, but today India stands, I think, without a real credible economic lever in the region. It is out of RCEP. It was never considered in the CPTPP. And also, as Satu mentioned, ASEAN is also in a question mark right now. ASEAN has been at the center of India's east-facing strategy, but things have fallen way short. You have things like the India-ASEAN Action Plan, but it has potential. It seems to be still not taken off the way it would have been seen. The connectivity infrastructure, China seems to be having a sort of negative, quote unquote, power over China. India is keeping itself out of some of these groupings without providing an alternative. So I think the Quad offers the way out of this quandary by giving India a very important place in the Indo-Pacific and the strategic shaping of the Indo-Pacific. And I think this is very important to the regional states. So the third driver, which is longer term, of course, is related to what is the elephant in the room, or I should say the dragon in the room, I suppose. It's whether or not we're seeing the outlines of a emerging Cold War 2.0 between US and China. This, of course, goes with the strong variant of what we know as the power transition theory, hotly debated in my field and among practitioners. But if we just simply look at the Lowy Institute's Asia power ranks, what I find interesting is that US and China are number 1 and 2, but the 3 following countries are of order of magnitude below: Japan, India, Russia. So are we looking at a bipolar environment in the Indo-Pacific? Now, Satu mentioned that we have many subcontexts. Yes, I agree. And I'm not suggesting that there's an inevitability to this kind of power transition theory, precisely because of some of the other subcontexts lying below. Now, let me just end by pointing to some dilemmas, the implications that arise out of this, and some of the dilemmas that I see. If indeed the Cold War 2.0 is the kind of dominant narrative on the ground, then what it does for India is that it, of course, brings into question its preferred strategic autonomy, independence of foreign policy making. And it's not just for India. Vietnam, for example, would be in a similar position, I think, as well. The question also comes up about how to insulate the land and sea security threats, which I think has been done to some extent, and what are the kind of unpredictable elements that's going to emerge if, in fact, it becomes more integrated. The Quad way, quote unquote, versus the ASEAN way, which we know is quite different, and that's going to be a dilemma for India. And so what I see is, given the fact that I mentioned in the medium-term lack of economic strategy for India in the Indo-Pacific, what we're left with then is a defense oriented strategy for India on the Indo-Pacific. And if that becomes a leading edge, the question is that a positive or negative? And I think that it has problems, because if India, looking ahead as a great power, if we learn anything from the past, is that countries need a comprehensive basis of power, economic, domestic resilience, and strategic capabilities. And so let me just conclude by saying that India's domestic impediments are increasingly visible in not just the mishandling of the COVID, but also other questions of democratic governance and so on, that it has to be coming into play to question about the resilience. And even though I would give it high marks for the nimbleness and the flexibility shown in coming up with the Quad strategy, I think that's only one element to keep in mind. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Ollapally. Those are relevant dilemmas, and I'm sure the audience is gleefully sinking its collective teeth into all those juicy problems. And now, to add to the richness of the fare being laid out, it's my great pleasure to invite Dr. Abhijit Singh to please take the floor and take it away.
Thank you, Admiral Chauhan. At the outset, I must thank NICE for inviting me to this excellent conclave. I have to say, I have enjoyed the discussion so far, the two presentations made by Satu, Dr. Ollapally, and of course, the excellent show by initial few slides by Admiral Chauhan. I can't help feel that, all that needs to be said on the issue of the Indo-Pacific and the Quad has in some ways already been covered. And in more thoughtful and eloquent fashion than I could have hoped to do. But I think I'll limit myself to just three basic observations to highlight three salient aspects, I think, of India's approach to the Indo-Pacific as also the Quad, simply for the reason that I think this is going to be important going forward. First, I think the central idea of the Indo-Pacific, as has been reiterated a number of times, is that it is not an exclusive club. And I think that despite all of the turbulences and disturbances that one has seen in the past year, caused by China's aggression on India's border, the skirmish that we saw happen in Ladakh, as also COVID, Delhi's approach to the Indo-Pacific remains inclusive and all-encompassing. Now, I think there has been some pressure from the US, at least some subtle nudging perhaps by the Biden administration, to instrumentalize the Indo-Pacific. And we know for a fact that the Biden administration is keen to formalize the Quad and stand it up as some sort of a sword arm or a pointy end of the Indo-Pacific, just as a way of balancing China. And despite that, I think India remains firmly on the path that was set by Prime Minister Modi in his 2018 Shangri-La address, when he said that, we're not a containment strategy, not a club, we're open to everybody. But I find it more interesting that in the pre-COVID era, before the pandemic came in, during President Trump's time in office, it had seemed for a while that there were not one versions, but two versions of the free and open Indo-Pacific. One, America's confrontational model that was built around, great power competition and strategic balancing, which I would argue still is quite the case. And India, ASEAN, you can say Japanese strategy or approach, more of a conciliatory, collegial version of the Indo-Pacific that prioritized inclusion, bridge building, and a form of stakeholdership. Yet, after the events in Ladakh, India had briefly seemed to drift towards the US model. Right after the Galwan incident, which we lost 20 soldiers, there was a sense that, this was not the old approach. There were Indian military was on high alert. Warships were deployed forward. The army formations were fortified. One got the sense that things were heating up. But fortunately, that phase didn't last too long. Things settled down, and we veered back on the course that had been originally set. Today, I think India is reaching out to Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia, Quad partners, trying to stitch up partnerships and in a variety of areas, be it vaccines, infrastructure, technology, resilient supply chains, everything. But you don't get to hear too much about security. India does not quite discuss the China issue with some of these countries, even though they are close partners. And my sense is that the US, in the past few months at least, has been more understanding of the competitive elements of that of the Indo-Pacific. To understand, this is not just about countering China, it's also about competing with China in a number of these areas that I've mentioned. And therefore, I think at the G7 meeting just a few days ago, the Build Back Better initiative was discussed. It's no coincidence that the US brought this issue up. And that, I think, is an appreciation of the Indian approach, perhaps the Japanese approach, that, we need to look for areas in which we can build alternatives for regional states beyond just focusing on countering China in the Indo-Pacific region. My second observation is that, beyond a mere convergence of interest, this is the rhetoric we always hear, this convergence of interest, so let's all come together. What we are now witnessing in the Indo-Pacific is really a confluence of thought. So again, as I said, it's no coincidence that we're talking about things like, security of sea lanes, freedom of navigation at sea and the skies, commercial access, investment rules, transparency in lending practices. There is a new realization that we need to evolve what is now being seen as a normative framework to tackle not just the hard security questions of China, but non-traditional security issues that matter to the Pacific, smaller Pacific countries and to smaller Indian Ocean states. So this is really the comprehensive approach, the Sagar strategy that Admiral Chauhan spoke about. And so beyond deterrence and hard security issues, what we are talking today is, marine governance, security of the commons, multipolar approach. I think that all is very much, a sort of narrative that the region appreciates. It's a developmental creed that a lot of nations identify with. My third observation, this is my last observation, is that partner states are more conceptually aligned, and yet they are operationally disparate, which really means that we agree strategically and politically on a number of things, but when it comes to hard operations on the ground, each one seems to have their own agenda, their own appreciation of what is feasible, what is not. And so some say what we are witnessing is really a splintering of the Indo-Pacific concept. India sees this as one integrated space, whereas a lot of Western powers, in the way they approach this operationally, tend to prioritize the Pacific. It's the more contested zone. It's the most strategically consequential region over the Indian Ocean, which is really seen as a highway. It's seen as a conduit for trade. This, again, is something that is worrisome, and that is going to have repercussions and ramifications going forward. And therefore, not surprisingly, I sense divisions within the Quad. I think India and Japan are not on the same page as perhaps the US and Australia, that would like to formalize the Quad, that would like to do much more in terms of military posturing and positioning and countering China. Even though, I agree, there's been a lot of discussions on vaccines, on technology, connectivity, supply chains, yet I think the US focus continues to remain on security, which going forward is a thing that we need to be careful about. Europe also, I have to say, has come up with these Indo-Pacific strategies, but it's very clear that they are more focused on the Pacific. They're talking about their relationships with ASEAN, but they're not so much into the Indian Ocean region. They believe India can take care of security on the Indian Ocean side. And so to conclude, I will simply say this, that there's the old aphorism that the more things change, the more they remain the same. And I think that is very much at play. I think China continues to be a troublesome actor in the South China Sea as well as the Indian Ocean region. The salami slicing that we have seen in the South China Sea, I think is happening now on the border with India. It's also beginning to happen gradually in the Indian Ocean region. China remains pivotal actor in the geo-economic realm. They are still the go-to actor when it comes to funding for a lot of these infrastructure projects. Now, it is unfortunate that when it comes to non-traditional security challenges, it's literal Asia and Africa that are bearing the brunt. And we really have no framework to look at those challenges. We are so focused on the China challenge and on bigger geopolitical and economic challenges that we're really not looking at all of this. That, again, I think is something to bear in mind. And finally, the Taiwan question. My American friends always ask this: what happens if China uses force in Taiwan? And I say then that it could well upset that inclusive apple cart of the Indo-Pacific. I think it's going to be no hold bar, and I think all countries are will be forced to take positions if China were to use force in Taiwan. So I leave you with a thought, just a last thought. Is it possible that we have reached the point of what is called security optimality in the Indo-Pacific, which means that the difference between the benefits and the costs seem to have been maximized, and from here we can do what we want, but we're really not going to draw anything more out of the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. This is where it sort of balances out, and so maybe we have, maybe we haven't, but there's one thing is sure: Indo-Pacific remains a work in progress. And to borrow an expression from Robert Frost, I'm going to end here. There is much more to do before we sleep. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Abhijit. You never disappoint. And so we have, already heard some really interesting phrases and thoughts ranging from, I really liked frayed multilateralism from Satu. And I really thought that the dilemmas that were projected, whether we are left with only a defense-oriented strategy or not, as India and Abhijit indicating that we are strategically aligned, operationally divergent, and projecting perhaps that we have a splintering of the Indo-Pacific concept at the conceptual level. These are very, very serious and very worrying, if I might say, thoughts. And but we're at halfway point, so let me not stay between the audience and Dr. Amit Gupta, who will be talking to us about some workable avenues for the Quad, and maybe, sort of putting the balance exactly where it needs to be placed. So, Dr. Gupta, I yield the floor to you. You have 7 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Admiral Chauhan. Pramod, excuse me. I'm going to need to share the screen because I've got 3 slides I want to show. So I need to get into that. One of the good things about being on this panel is I'm following a bunch of Quad skeptics, so I don't feel particularly out of place. Let me start by saying this. I've spent the last 7 years traveling between Tokyo, Canberra, and New Delhi, talking to military officials, diplomats, academics, and you walk away underwhelmed with the idea of the Quad. And I'll get to why right now. It's, oh, sorry. Here we go. Screen share. And right. Okay. Can you all see this? Okay, great. Look, if you look at the Quad in its, here's my take on the Quad in its most basic way. And that is, in terms of its military potential and its economic potential, it has a long way to go. Militarily, here are the basic issues. Number one, the United States, Japan, and Australia have a very high level of interoperability. India is not in that interoperability grid. Abhijit Singh knows this, Admiral Chauhan knows this. In fact, the general consensus is that in terms of communications and surveillance technology, India may be a generation to a generation and a half behind the other 3 members. So if you want to do joint operations, it's problematic. Secondly, I've talked to the Australians at length about this, and they talk a good talk. But the bottom line is they are not interested in going into the South China Sea or the East China Sea. They say their strategic perimeter ends at the southern coast of Indonesia and Malaysia. And they're certainly not coming deep into the Indian Ocean to help India out at any point of time. Third, the Japanese are in the middle of a demographic disaster. I call them the aging samurai. And the reason for that is very simple. Their population is going from 126 million to 107 million by 2050. The median age is going from 46.5 to 53.3. And war is a young man's game. Ask the Japanese where they're going to find the people to man their battleships and their Aegis destroyers and so on. And the answer you get is we're not sure. Second thing to keep in mind is China dominates the global economic stage now, and it certainly dominates Asia. This is the data from the European Union's Trade Directorate. China's largest trading partner is no longer the US or the European Union, it is ASEAN, and it's at 614 billion euro. Next is the EU, and then you can go down the list. And as I always point out, everybody on that list is an American ally or an American well-wisher. So what have the Chinese been able to achieve in Asia? They've been able to move people away from a very strong pro-American position to one where they realize their economic bread and butter lies in greater cooperation with China. I do want to talk about Australia because there's this very naive idea that the Australians are power players. It's a small country, it's 23 million people. And the joke at the National Defense College in America is the Australians are good for looking after the bar. And if anybody has a question on this, please do ask. They do 160 billion Australian dollars of trade with China. The economic interdependency is huge. Mineral sales are what led to the boom in the Australian economy. 27 years, they didn't have a recession. 25% of their tourist revenues come from China. Most foreign students are from China, and they sell $12 billion of agro products. They cannot afford to play hardball with China, even though Scott Morrison was more Trumpian than Trump. And that then brings me to, okay, if the military and the economic side, as the three previous speakers pointed out, has considerable problems attached to them, what is workable? And I think the answer is you need a quad which can talk non-traditional security issues and come up with an alternative economic vision, which is what Abhijit Singh was talking about, for the Indo-Pacific. And three easy things to do in the next few years are, number one, an effective vaccine initiative. The Chinese, contrary to what people may say, have spread their vaccine across Asia. Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia are being able to vaccinate their people because they've got the Chinese vaccine. They're now going to be making Sputnik 5, much as India is. And they are distributing it in Latin America, elsewhere. This is where the Japanese and the Australians need to put their money where their mouth is and suggest, let's build up India's vaccine capabilities. Because the last Quad meeting talked about 1 billion vaccines by the end of 2022. That's nothing, given that we're nearly a global population of 8 billion people. Second one, which I'm really interested in, is an Indo-Pacific educational initiative, because most of the Indo-Pacific has fallen behind the developed world in terms of having the skill sets which are needed in a globalized system. Third, the US in some way, shape, or form has to come back into the TPP. And I'll end with this one. Given everything that is going on in the cyber field, and given that the Indians, the Australians, the Japanese, and most of Asia is highly vulnerable to cyber attacks, it's time to talk about a cybersecurity architecture, which can be led by the Americans, bring everybody in, and start talking about how do you build resilience in that area. All right, that's it. Thank you very much. And thank you, Admiral Chauhan. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gupta. That was really good. I'm really quite impressed by the fact that you thought that there should be a trust given to the Indo-Pacific educational initiative and also to cybersecurity architecture. I couldn't agree with you more, but it gives me great pleasure now. And as I said earlier, a sense of keen anticipation to be able to now request Dr. Aparna Pande to please take the floor and share her views how the USA's Indo-Pacific strategy fits into the USA's grand strategy and where India fits into that construct. Dr. Pande, take it away. 7 minutes.
Thank you, Vice Admiral Chauhan, and thank you to Dr. Jaiswal and Nice, and a pleasure to be with so many people I know. And I actually echo a lot of what others said, but I'll try and say something different in my 7 minutes. So American grand strategy for the Asia Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific as we call it today. But basically, if we go back to the end of the Second World War, The aim was to set up an Asian diplomatic and security architecture based on a network of partners and allies. What has happened in the last 2 decades is that the economic and military rise of China has challenged American preeminence because China seeks to create an Asian order with Chinese primacy. The US Indo-Pacific strategy was based primarily on re-engagement with old allies, creating new partners. The reason I use a different word is everybody understands there are some countries like India which don't want to be called an ally across the region, and construct a configuration that will help counter or stop this Chinese march. Now, India has been viewed as a critical partner in these efforts. Why? Because as a democratic country with a strong economy and expanding military, it could be the ideal counter. India also has a border dispute with China and a population large enough to match China's. It could be an effective partner for the United States in sharing the burden of providing security in the Indo-Pacific. This is why we see the last 3 US administrations, whether the pivot to Asia or the Indo-Pacific strategy, has always emphasized India's critical role. From the defining partnership of the 21st century to the 2 countries being, and I quote here, 2 bookends of stability on either side of the globe, standing for greater security and prosperity for our citizens and people. The 2017 US National Security Strategy spoke of India as a leading global power with strong strategic and defense partner of the United States, which will expand our defense and security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, South and Central Asia. A few months ago in March 2021, the Biden administration released its interim national security guidance document that again spoke of deepening partnership with India, a robust presence in the Indo-Pacific because of America's vital national interests. At some level, this ties in with India and how Indian leaders have viewed India's role. There's a belief that India is a global player, not just an Asian power. But the belief in India being an Asian leader goes back centuries. The problem India has faced is since the 1990s, it has viewed how China has built a close relationship in what India considers its backyard or front yard. Its neighborhood from the Gulf of Aden to the Straits of Malacca. And Chinese efforts to encircle it, whether it's string of pearls theory or strategic encirclement, military and naval bases across the region. The previous speakers have gone into details about this. And so over the last decade, India has tried to build up its civilizational, diplomatic and economic ties to counter these, to build or reinforce strategic economic relations from West Asia, as we refer to the Middle East, to the Pacific Islands, from the east and south coast of Africa to ASEAN. India and the United States do agree on a broad definition of that very fuzzy concept of Indo-Pacific, upholding a rules-based order. But as Abhijit pointed out very well, there are differences, and I'd like to go into those before I conclude my conversation. Despite closer relations with the United States, India is still reluctant to join any formal alliance structure. We are a virtual American ally. We are reluctant to be a formal American ally. India is reluctant to cede power to a collective security mechanism, and therefore joining any alliance which is military or appears to be military is problematic. As a continental and maritime power, India views Indo-Pacific strategy as primarily maritime and not sufficiently geared to India's concerns on the continental landmass. Delhi understands the threat it faces on the land and sea border from China, but there's a recognition of its limitations, economic and military. Further, in a Hobbesian sense, India believes it needs to fend for itself when it comes to the China threat, especially on the land border, and does not believe any country will come to its assistance. Finally, India has preferred a multipolar and still prefers a multipolar world order, not a unipolar or a bipolar world order. This, along with the desire for strategic autonomy, a sort of special focus on India's immediate periphery of South Asia, rather than the broader Indo-Pacific, when it comes to security concerns, means that India will prefer to be part of multiple organizations and follow a sort of a semi-hedging strategy rather than being part of any one grouping which is openly confrontational or openly against another country in what sort of, could be the US-China peer rivalry, which is, or peer competition, which is going to happen in the coming years and decades. I will stop here and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Pande. I thought that the comments you made on, the fact that the USA is simply betting on India. You get shorn of all the rest of the argument. The USA is placing its bets on India. Now, is that a wise bet or not a wise bet? We will leave it for our audience, our experts, and time. But it's now time for us to, in any good dinner, you normally save the best for the end. So Professor Jeffrey Payne, who's, in my opinion, definitely deserves to wade through a lot of earlier repast for. Jeffrey, 7 minutes, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Vice Admiral. It's always good to see you. And to my fellow panelists, obviously to Dr. Jaiswal and Nice, it's a real honor to be with you today. So a lot of what I've covered has already been discussed. And I do find myself, I would not define myself as a Quad cheerleader, but given the status of this panel, maybe I can be presented that way today. And I think maybe it's because of the soapbox, the platform upon which I stand here in Washington, D.C. I do have to do the normal statement that everything I'm saying today is my own personal opinion and does not reflect the views of any U.S. government institution, the Department of Defense, and so on and so forth. I work at NISA, which NISA is a DoD institution doing engagement throughout the Indian Ocean rim. And so my comments today are kind of based upon how I see the conversation being formulated, not necessarily at the 30,000 foot strategic level, but more at the 10,000 foot kind of meeting point of the strategic and operational, not just within the DoD, but through the interagency of the United States. And the first kind of thing that I would say is that there is an ongoing process of narrowing and determining the definition of the Indo-Pacific by the United States. Right now, it breaks down to kind of the orientation of Indo-Pacific Command, the seams of the U.S. Department of Defense. But there is increasing conversation, especially on the Hill, about cultural, economic, social processes that destroy that definition when you look at the Indian Ocean component of it. So while there is a use of it as defined by the previous national security and national defense strategies, the conversation is ongoing. And so the U.S. has not definitively decided kind of in how it works, the Indo-Pacific, what that means. And I bring that up because the United States is increasingly interested in what I would call connective tissue throughout the Indo-Pacific. You can call that alliance building, you can call it partnership building, you can call it interoperability, whatever buzzword you want to use, but essentially understanding that there are a lot of existing connections between Indian Ocean regional states, Pacific littoral states that have nothing to do with the United States. And these are strengths and learning curves that the United States can interact with to gain a better understanding of what is now the primary focal point geographically for the United States government. So from an administrative point of view, from an operational point of view of the United States, there is a transition that's going on. If you look at the Defense Department, so you have the priority theater increasingly becoming the Indo-Pacific instead of the MENA region, so the Middle East, North Africa, which has dominated the previous 20 years of DoD thinking. The issue is that there's a substantial amount of depth in the MENA region and how engagement is pursued in, say, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, the Levant, North Africa, and so forth, that is not present in the Indo-Pacific. And so this is where you see a lot of how the trend line will shape the Department of Defense over the next 15 or 20 years, that depth will move further east. And then the perspective of the Indo-Pacific will migrate further west. So this will help familiarize AFRICOM, CENTCOM, EUCOM with the understanding of what's going on in the Indo-Pacific. And likewise, the depth that has existed, that is not present in the Indo-Pacific, will migrate and be built in the Indo-Pacific. So that's something that I think is a logical data point, but is often not brought up. Moving on, the issue of how partnerships are going to be built by the United States and how they're going to be pursued, it's based upon an understanding that China is increasingly seen by the United States as a maritime, not a continental actor. And you see this not only in how its trade is being pursued, but the emphasis of the Maritime Silk Road Initiative versus the Silk Road Economic Belt as part of the BRI. This is also corresponds with thinking about the Quad and how it can matter in the Indo-Pacific. And then also how additional actors can participate with the United States and the Quad members on various avenues. And specifically one mentioned routinely in the United States is France, because of the depth that France has in the Western Indian Ocean. Its relationships, its maritime familiarity, its economic and cultural ties, all of that has a very big impact. And then the United States also isn't currently engaged, started during the Trump administration, but is intensified during the Biden administration, of building a whole of government approach and perspective towards the Indo-Pacific. This is often portrayed in Washington as a focus on China all the time, but it is more diverse than that, it is more complicated than that. It may not show up on CNN, it may not show up in the Washington Post, but that depth is very much present. And then there's an increasing recognition based upon a lot of the experts, subject matter experts working in the US government, who work at think tanks, who are local universities here in DC and elsewhere, that the region has long not been listened to, and it's far time for the United States to truly listen to the region. And so this is where, in a practical sense, a lot of the non-traditional security threats are really now becoming a cornerstone for US engagement in the Indo-Pacific, specifically in the Indian Ocean region. When you have engagement along Eastern Africa about climate change, about IU fishing, about EEZ security, all of these things are being taken far more seriously than they ever have. Part of that is because the ever-present specter of China and the kind of strategic competition that is shaping US foreign policy to a degree. But regardless of the kind of background, that's an important kind of corner that has been turned by the United States. And then one thing I'll kind of conclude with is there's already been discussions of narratives, and I think that China has a narrative that has taken hold through its economic might. There's a narrative that is coming from our friends in India. There's a narrative from Japan. The US narrative has been muddled and muffled, and I think part of the reason is some of the lessons learned during the 20 years of the kind of forever wars and countering violent extremist engagements that dominated military thinking. The US tried to keep a relatively low profile in its narrative, not in what it was doing, but in how it discussed what it was doing in the Middle East because of political sensitivity. So a little bit of the evolution is going to be the United States figuring out how to kind of bang its own drum and kind of sing through its own horn when it comes to what it's doing in the Indo-Pacific, because the United States is not without its own tools vis-a-vis strategic competition. And one example I'll bring up is that for me, the Quad has always been about niche capabilities. It's never been a grand strategy. Japan has specific things that it can do better than anyone else. India, likewise. Australia, likewise. The United States, likewise. And it's coordinating all of those niche capabilities. One that the United States is very effective at, that we are increasingly discussing, is the fact of how data can be shared among littoral and regional states in the Indo-Pacific, because the issue now is we have too much data. It's not that we don't have enough, it's actually analyzing and compiling and processing that data. And given the open source resources that are available commercially, that's something that the United States can help lead on. Just like Japan and India have a very effective tradition of port and infrastructural development, Australia has specific capabilities with modernization of specific coastal infrastructure and likewise. So I think I see the Quad more as a niche partnership that cumulative builds progress versus a kind of grand strategic vision. So I'll end with that. Vice Admiral, back to you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Once again, like the others, you never disappoint. I really, I'm on your side with regard to the Quad. I may not be a Quad trumpeter, but I'm certainly I don't see Quad as an underwhelming concept either. But you know, who are the two of us against all these many experts? Okay, so let me make one or two observations before I take questions from the audience, because the chat box is rapidly filling up. One is that, you know, this business about whether India ought to be aligning its interests to anybody is actually a misplaced interest, and I would misplaced statement, and I would like to put a stop to that. India's interests are India's. They are not determined by China. They are not determined by the United States. If you could magically erase China from the face of the earth, it would not change a single Indian objective or interest one whit. The second is whether interoperability is actually all about tech. And I think that if you are associated deeply with Air Force and air power, you could be forgiven for believing that all interoperability lies in the technical domain. In truth, there's a large amount of interoperability which lies outside the technical domain. And here, India is a generation and a half ahead in many cases of some of the countries that are being mentioned. The lack of Indian military viability is therefore moot. I think there are very few countries on the planet who can, on a passage exercise, actually sensibly operate at the highest end of naval activity, which is aircraft carriers and nuclear-powered submarines. And I think that that has some statement to be made. But I fully grant the views of our experts, and it is not my intention at all to exchange volleys with them. I will be on the losing side anyway. I really did appreciate also the comment about France. And I think that, you know, one of the great follies currently in India with vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific is that the Indian security establishment somehow inexplicably is refusing to take the European Union seriously in the security domain. And I think it's unable to drop some historical baggage. The best way to get into an elevator is actually when it's on the ground floor. To climb onto it when it's on the ascent is pretty hard. But those are my comments, and they're not particularly relevant compared to the wealth of the information that has been put out by our eminent panelists. And now here come some of the more difficult questions, and I'm very grateful to the audience for posing them. Let me start with, I'm not going to name any of the people who have asked the questions. Of course, they're there on the chat box, so you could look at that. There is a southern quad of Australia, France, New Zealand, and the USA. So Australia, India, Japan, and the USA might form a northern quad. So in case, Abhijit, you thought that we were not splintered enough, here is some more splintering. And I did want to ask you, what is your thought in this matter that means that we can look at a strong centralized partnership between Australia, France, New Zealand, and the USA rather than Japan, because I think the others are common. But India too is missing from this southern quad. Now I have strong views against this, but that's not for me to comment. I would much rather hear Abhijit. Maybe you can try taking this on, since you were the one who talked about splintered structures. Right.
You want me to answer right now, sir?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Now this is an interesting question. Northern Quad and the Southern Quad. Look, I think I realize that I may have positioned myself as a sort of a Quad skeptic, but I'm not. I'm far from that. And what I think really is that in appreciating the value of the Quad as it stands today, I mean, I'm not talking about the Northern and the Southern, I'm just saying the Quad as it is today, we have to appreciate that the Indo-Pacific might be one integrated theater, but really the Pacific and the Indian Ocean have a very different dynamic of security. So it is true that the Pacific, the South China Sea, as also the EC, are more contested, operationally contested. On the Indian Ocean side, it is true that non-traditional security issues are preponderant. We simply have to find a framework in which we can address some of those non-traditional security challenges. But the problem is that non-traditional security calls for a level of investment, a kind of investment that does not promise any returns, at least not in the near term. So a number of big countries are very reluctant to get into areas where you don't know what really the direction of effort is and what might happen if you're successful, you don't know what it's going to look like. Therefore, the focus at the moment seems to be on the Pacific side. I am actually of the view that if India has to maximize its options with regard to the Quad, India should be willing to play some part in the Pacific. Because if we play the game with China in the Indian Ocean, we are we are playing a defensive game. And that will mean that China will dominate because this is our area of sensitivity. This is not their area of sensitivity. We need to be in the Pacific because that's where they get the strategic heebie-jeebies, as I call it. That's where they've got serious reservations about someone operating. I think if we were to agree for a Southern Quad, we are basically pulling out of that, we are pulling out of that theater. We're saying we have no stakes in the Pacific. You can do whatever you want to there. We'll simply play the game in the Indian Ocean. And that would be good for, I mean, in one sense, it makes perfect sense because our interests lie here. But it's China that's going to keep making the incursions in this space. We are going to always be pushing back China. Rather, it's a better idea for us to be in the Pacific. So I'm really not buying into this thing of a Southern Quad. And I think we've got to look at the possibilities inherent in the Quad. And I would go back to what Jeffrey pointed out. He is absolutely right. We've got to look at ways in which we can optimize, that optimality concept that I gave out. This is not about us feeling that the military option has optimized itself. There's nothing more you can get out of it. I think there's much more you can get out of it. And I think we've got to be in the Pacific in some way at least. Thanks.
Yeah, I wanted to say thank you for that clear rebuttal, but I also want to hear from Satu. Satu, since you're generally a specialist in that area as well as so many other areas of the world, I wanted to ask you, while China is looking at and succeeding actually in large measure in places like Kiribati and the effort that they've made in Kiribati and weaning away that country even after for a shortish while it actually recognized the Republic of China rather than the People's Republic, and biding its time until it could actually reverse the thing. And therefore, is the third island chain actually lying along the South Pacific or not? And therefore, we concentrate our efforts as India, should India concentrate some effort, as Abhijit suggests, in the Pacific, and whether India should actually up its game vis-a-vis the South Pacific Island Forum. So very, very briefly.
Yeah, thank you. Let me be very brief. The Pacific is a big place. The Southern Quad really refers to cooperation on the Pacific Islands, both the North and South Pacific. There's three observations to be made here. First, the Northern Pacific is very much closely aligned with the United States and Japan. If you look at the social, demographic, economic, military factors in the Northern Pacific, particularly with the three compact freely associated states, the Republic of Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau, are indivisible Pacific, which runs essentially from Hawaii through Guam, through the Northern Pacific, are, I think, pretty strongly secured. I think the current negotiations for the renewal of the compacts going on in Congress will be finished by 2023, and in Palau's case by roughly 2024. France, Australia, and New Zealand further cement that. The White House under the past administration announced a further solidification of our Coast Guard presence, both in American Samoa and in Guam. So I would say that the Northern Pacific is well is seeing a lot of engagement. I would flag for this audience, since a lot of talk has been given about what's going on in Washington, that the only two large pieces of legislation that specifically address a subregion in the Indo-Pacific and are currently making their way through various complexities of the congressional lawmaking process are the Blue Pacific Act and the Honoring Oceania Act. Both of them deal with the Pacific in profound ways. And as far as I can tell from my historical research, at no time in American history have there been two bills in both the House and the Senate that deal specifically with the Pacific Islands. So I think that's, we must continue our cooperation with Australia and New Zealand very closely. The recent debacle at the Pacific Islands Forum with the split between Micronesia, which is the North Pacific, and the rest of the Pacific is profound and needs to be resolved. There is a process, a troika process that's managing this. So I would say that India will have to choose. India has started upkeep in the Pacific, including with Fiji in particular, and has a role to play through a number of avenues. But I think the constellation of the local balance of forces and balance of power is very heavily in the North Pacific with the US and with Japan, and in South Pacific with Australia and New Zealand. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Limaye. And let me bring Dr. Gupta in, who's got a couple of points that he would like to make. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, this is not the only question from the audience.
Very briefly, there are 4.5 million New Zealanders, 2.5 million of whom are taxpayers. Their Air Force has an Air Commodore as their chief. They have no fighter aircraft. And at Maxwell Air Force Base, where I work, we have more transport aeroplanes than the entire New Zealand Air Force put together. Okay? So New Zealand's a non-starter. And what they say is, we'll show up just to show that the New Zealanders are waving the flag. Don't expect anything from us. This is reality, okay? Second thing is, American policy has been based on something called the Five Eyes: United States, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. Which one of these countries is relevant in Asia except for the United States? Japan should be in the Five Eyes. Germany should be in the Five Eyes. You have to move away from this 1945 racial concept of world affairs to a globalized concept of world affairs. If you do that, you can make the Quad work. And I'll just say one last thing here. Singapore is far better in terms of intelligence, communications, military capability than the New Zealanders. How come nobody's talking to them? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Those were all germane points. And Dr. Ollapally and Dr. Jeffrey Payne, here's one for the two of you to sort of bat around. There's a clear disagreement among Quad members on many issues, including Myanmar, and how then would a partnership move, such a partnership move in Asia? At the moment, the Quad seems to be dealing with subjects on a bilateral basis, and ASEAN seems to have, I don't want to use the words that are used in the question, but ASEAN seems to have some difficulties in finding sufficient robustness in its dealings with China. So, Deepa, would you like to sort of address the issue of the disagreements of Quad and whether that will hobble this organization to a point where it is only able to function in dyadic terms?
That really, thank you for that question. I think it cuts to one of the huge problems that the Quad has faced since day one, that not just the level of commitment, but the true interests of each of these countries, to what extent do they really converge? And so I think the idea that Abhijit said about splintering the concept, I think the concept itself is pretty secure now, the idea of Indo-Pacific. The question comes down to what happens on the ground level in terms of policy coordination. And one of the things that I said was that it seems to be that there's more of a broad coalition of the willing to send a strong signal to a rising China, rather than having the sort of specific policies. So on India and Japan, I think, have a lot more in common than India and Australia. I mean, that's just, if you look at their their own strategic interests, it makes sense, development-wise as well. They also don't have any historical baggage. Also, expectations. I think, you know, different countries seem to have taken the lead at different times. Of Japan under Abe, now the US, whereas it was not before. So each one that's in the leadership is going to push their particular agenda. And so this is where I think in the Indian case, overselling the concept will result in a situation where people are going to ask, what's the result? Why are you not doing anything on Myanmar? Why is there not a common statement? I think that's the danger, frankly. I think it's impossible to get a consistent policy on every hot topic foreign policy item that comes up in Asia or anywhere else for that matter. But I think that's the beauty of Quad, if I may, and that is that it is flexible. I think that even the habit of cooperation and so forth, they understand that you've got to give leeway. In Tokyo, there was no joint statement because there was too many things that the India and Japan did not want to come out in a sharp way with China. I think that's just the fact. And as Vice Admiral Chauhan said in the beginning, India has its own interests. It doesn't want to get derailed just because they want to make a joint statement or make some grandstanding. I don't think you're going to see grandstanding because of that. So I think they're going to have to grapple with these differences and do it in a mature way.
Thank you so much. And let me turn it over to Jeffrey. Jeffrey, do you think this business of Teddy Roosevelt's comment about talk softly and carry a big stick is the better approach for Quad, rather than, as Deepa quite correctly says and cautions against, which is grandstanding and raising expectations to an unrealistic level? And also, already you can see from the questions themselves that there are expectations which seem to be ahead of time, and people's patience levels seem to be far lower than what might be demanded in complex arrangements with countries that have you know, their own interests to look after, and yet are trying to work a collective. And this is no different, or it's not different from the difficulties that bedevil NATO or any other collective organization. You just have to muddle it along quite often. So Jeffrey, what is your view?
Honestly, Vice Admiral, it probably would be similar to yours in the sense that you're going to have cheerleaders. I think there are people in just taking Washington who see the Quad, or at least imply that the Quad is some grand security architecture that will define the 21st century. I personally don't care if it is or not, because the whole point is the narrative is there. So from a political point of view, it's already useful because the first iteration of the Quad never caught on as a narrative. It has now. And then the 4 countries involved, they're either formally allied with each other, or they have gained deep operational familiarity. So right now, India-US relations, to use that as a vignette, military to military relations are stronger than they ever have been. The amount of familiarity among the navies, among air forces, coast guards, the amount of bilateral training exercises that take place, and then including additional regional states in that bilateral engagement is great. The other aspects of government to government relationships are getting deeper and more sophisticated. There's still a long way to go, but the point is that progress is being made. And I think when it comes to kind of the narrative, the cheerleaders need to create that narrative, and that's positive because A, it'll drive China nuts from kind of a Washingtonian perspective, but B, it also kind of indicates that we don't need to be concurrent on every single thing. India's interests in the Indian Ocean region do not correspond completely with how the US sees the Indian Ocean region, nor should it ever be the case. And so by not being completely enveloped in each other's affairs, it gives all these various states room to maneuver. It gives, for instance, Japan and India the ability to coordinate on development of the Colombo port. It gives the United States the ability to try to navigate with the UK the status of the Chagos. All of these things have to be deciphered, and if they have to be put inside this larger quadrilateral formulation, it's not going to work. We would suffer exactly what ASEAN's suffering from right now.
Yeah, absolutely right. So, but let me turn to Dr. Pande, who's sort of been left out of the melee thus far, and turn the next question across to you, Aparna. And that is that India followed a hedging strategy in the past and doesn't seem to have shed this shibboleth of strategic autonomy. In many cases, India appears to have a great fancy for a rhetorical term which would have done well had it come from Madison Avenue, but somehow it comes from New Delhi. So would India be able to walk this tightrope this time, especially when one of the opponents of the Great Power competition is China, its next door neighbor, and etc., and another is the world leader, the USA. So does India have any chance of sustaining a middle path, or not a middle path, but a path, which is defined by India's own interests, assuming that the Indian security establishment and its overall national establishment is actually able to enunciate India's interests, even in maritime terms. And of course, Deepa said that India looks at maritime without looking necessarily at the linkage between the maritime and the continental difficulties. And that's part of the strategic tightrope. I don't entirely agree, but then if I was to raise every objection to everything that has been said, how would we meet again and have a septet, shall we say? But Aparna,
thank you, Vice Admiral. 3 quick points. One, yes, India has followed traditionally a hedging strategy, whether it's non-alignment or strategic autonomy. The advantage India had during the Cold War was that both the poles of the bipolar world order, neither of them craved Indian territory. Neither of them were Indian neighbors. Soviet Union was some distance away, United States some oceans away. Both of them at some level recognized India as the hegemon, even if India wasn't really playing that role most of the time. And while they had relations with India's neighbors, Pakistan especially, it didn't really hurt India's interest to a large extent. Today, India's problem is that in this peer rivalry, there's one country which actually holds on to Indian territory, craves more Indian territory, does not recognize India as the hegemon, and actually believes that the Indian Ocean region is part of its sphere of influence. And the other country would like India to play a bigger role and would like India, it's actually betting on India. So at some level, India's interests are on the side of the country which is betting on India, not the country which wants Indian territory. So I would say, in this context, India knows which country is on India's side. Now, what India does, at the end of the day, you know this better than I do. I would just say that India's security apparatus needs to decide where India is going to go and what India wants to do. That decision needs to be taken. And I don't know if that decision has really been taken, which direction India wants to go and what it needs to do. But at some level, the global reality and India's interests are clear. Thank you.
That's very well put. And I think that, the problem is when you deal with such erudite experts as yourself, one tends to end up agreeing with too many views. And then one looks at oneself and says, so which is my view then? So I have 1 or 2 views that I would like to reserve. But let me address. Yeah, Abhijit, please go right.
I actually just had a 2-finger to add to that excellent comment by Aparna. On the question of strategic autonomy, I would agree with Dr. Rajan Mohan's view. He's written extensively about this, and he said that our strategic autonomy is really not about equidistance. it was really about, it was really an omnidirectional engagement. So we wanted to have the freedom to engage with whoever we wanted to engage for our own national and strategic interests. And I completely understand that impulse. But I think the point that sort of Aparna alluded to is that when you're transactional and you go to multiple partners, the optics of that isn't so good. And also the fact that, it's principally as also from a value standpoint, somehow questionable to go to different players for just to meet your own interests and not really satisfy their own requirements from you as a partner and an ally. I think Aparna may be right in pointing out that if we have chosen the US as that strategic partner that we want to be close to, we've got to open ourselves in a way that we can also deliver on the American agenda. I don't think it's good enough for us to say that this is not in our interest, so we simply won't do it. We've got to look for ways in which we can also American needs and requirements from its partners. And just on the question of China, I would say that China might not be the only factor when it comes to the Indo-Pacific and the Quad, but I think it is a principal factor. And I think America's underscoring of the China factor is something that India needs to take into account. But I think India's view on this should be that the Chinese have two different strategies for the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And the Chinese strategy in the Indian Ocean is not about military dominance. It's a composite strategy that has a number of elements to it. And infrastructure is one, technology is one, the manner in which they're investing in the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think the Indians and Americans need to sit together to come up with two different strategies for the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And I think that's one way forward. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, Deepa, just way right in. But let me put this second question, which is very closely related to the first, which we are already debating, and then that will give you all some more sort of room in which to express your views. That is that in the case of the Indo-Pacific policy, one of our viewers says that India is in the mood for dating rather than marrying, and it doesn't want to actually marry the West. It just wants to date them, particularly with respect to China. So apart from the holy grail of strategic autonomy, do you think that much depends on how the US-China power play is going to be in the future, and therefore India will be willy-nilly shaped in its responses by being sensitive to that? It also means that India is satisfied with being a marginal player in this particular activity. And last but not the least, I would like to turn to you and to Amit to say that, India is very often likened to the Shakespearean cat in the adage. We want the fish, but we don't want to get our paws wet. And so to what degree do you think that we ought to, as Abhijit suggests, commit to a greater amount of sensitivity to the partner with whom we, as Aparna says, would like to align, or for a skeptic, it might be knowing which side our bread is buttered on. Deepa.
Actually, thank you so much. There's a lot of excellent points in that questions. And just to go back to the one point about strategic autonomy, I think it's important to state that in this more globalized world, the idea of strategic autonomy, India, ironically, can be strengthened by a closer relationship with the US or with other countries that are, sort of in understanding China's rise. And therefore, if India needs greater military capabilities, it needs technology, it needs infrastructure help, it needs such and such. The idea is that if you move closer to the US, you can actually have a better leverage and better position vis-a-vis China independently, that in fact India can be an independently stronger actor with a greater strategic alliance with the US. But then of course that means that the United States has to understand India's particular needs and history and so forth. And I think that is a possibility. So I feel that there's something that we're missing. It's sort of it's not sort of a binary yes or no question, all or nothing kind of issue. And you can see how even the Chinese, in terms of their own relationships, you know, they have never been shy about courting Japan economically. I mean, how has Japan in the past been able to be so closely reliant on Chinese economy, but it has been able to have a strong strategic partnership with the US? I think that there's a much more open architecture that is possible in the current period. And so I would say that I think we cannot see this as a kind of a zero-sum kind of game or all or nothing. That's my point.
Thank you. Yeah, that's prudent and wise. So Amit, you know, give us something provocative.
Okay. India-America relationship, there are 6 of them. Mill-to-mill, political, which is Jaishankar playing footsie in Washington. Bangalore and Silicon Valley, Indian, yes, I know, I thought that one would make people laugh. Indian universities and Indian students, American universities, Indian diaspora, India, and lastly, Hollywood and Bollywood, which really hasn't gelled so far. Here's what I think. Look, there is no emotional ties with India and the United States. When Harry married Meghan, that was shown for 6 hours on American television, which is, you know, mind-numbing, stupid exercise. When Narendra Modi got re-elected to the world's largest democracy as the prime minister, it was a 1-minute news event. So ask yourself where you stand in the global scheme of things. What you can do is appeal to American industry. And I've written about this. 1, India is 1.3 billion people, maybe 1.4, waiting for the census on that. If India works with America and establishes a 5G network, the West wins the 5G war over the Chinese. That is perhaps the biggest thing that India can offer right now. 2, you have this huge population of Indians who are intelligent, articulate, could be used for all kinds of things. The Obama administration signed an agreement with India to set up 200 community colleges. You don't need more degrees in English literature and sociology. You do need community colleges, you know. Why not implement that? 3, Make in India, which I could go on for hours with you on. People just keep focusing on defense. There's 29 other items in it. Hospitality, healthcare, services, well-being, I can go down the list. Get the world to invest in those. And last point to make here is, you know, and this has to be told in simple English to people. There is a big difference between the Indians, the Canadians, the New Zealanders, the Australians, and the Europeans. The Indians will fight the Chinese. The Indians will take casualties. Abhijit, you know this. Admiral Chauhan, you know this, okay? Go look at the Afghanistan ISAF experience. You know, the nickname for ISAF is I Saw Americans Fight. Who took the casualties there? It's worth asking. And who took the casualties in Iraq? The Australians lost 2 people in Iraq. If you bring these points out, I think you can have a very solid India-US relationship. And, you know, Deepa is right. Why not take joy in making money off your enemies? The Japanese and the Chinese hate each other. As I showed you the slide, they have $300 billion in bilateral trade. And India can't move away from that. 70% of India's cell phone market is dominated by the Chinese, though I'm told now they claim they're Indian companies. If this is the reality, get into greater economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific, offer what you can to make yourself more attractive to the West, Stop doing the stuff that we invented, Pushpak Viman and yoga. Nobody's interested in that. In Alabama, we're trying to ban yoga in schools, just so you know. And I'll end with this. Europe is a bunch of declining nations. They're aging. I can show you the numbers if you like. And they've all done rather poorly on COVID. Leave out the Finns and people like that. Where do you think the money is going to go? Britain's Prime Minister, who sent QE2 or whatever that ship is called to the South China Sea, came down with COVID after he dismissed it as a disease. Now, what is the push in Britain? Let's put more money into healthcare. Well, if you're going to put more money into healthcare, you can't have aircraft carriers with F-35s on it. So sell this pragmatically. That is what I would say.
Yep, can't argue with many of those points. I also want to, however, bring up a point for your own consideration for all of you, and that is that when we are talking about, this business of get aligned with American technology and you'll be able to get better, there is a problem dealing with American industry. I have spoken personally to American industry, to the American India Business Council, and by and large on both sides there are shopkeepers. There are very few actual industrialists. One chap says, I've got this, can of blueberries, would you like that? And the other guy says, I prefer strawberries. This is not how we could move forward with America, but the belief that this 1.4 billion Indian market is sufficient for us to build a technological relationship may need some thinking. Some more thinking. What we need to do is jointly have that educational piece in place so that we can jointly sit and work things ab initio. It is not that Indians are dumb. Indians just need an environment of being challenged continuously, and that may be possible in relation to the Quad and not just the USA, so that we don't end up in a dyadic relationship discussion right now. So one more sort of left outfield kind of question is about Russia, and said that India used to have a strong logistics agreement with Russia. It was working out a strong logistics agreement with Russia. And what happened to that? Has it been put off because it's incompatible with India's similar bilateral relations or agreements with Quad nations? And has that stymied the issue with Russia? So I just want to give a short steer here and to say that, the Indian relationship with Russia is still pretty strong, and there's no way that India can just dump it, and nor should it. India must learn how to play, as Abhijit said, different games and ride different horses on different courses. And the Americans must learn that, there are compulsions that need to be understood. And so too must Quad. And then I buy into Jeffrey's point that that's precisely the value of Quad, because it allows for maneuver. So if anybody else wants to weigh in on the Russian question, I'll be very happy to allow that. But if not, I think we are pretty much done with everybody except will the Bay of Bengal region actually become the epicenter of maritime conflict between India and China? So Abhijit, whether the India-China gameplay in the Indian Ocean is so comprehensive that it will eliminate military interaction is itself problematic as a proposition. And here's a sharp question to address. So Jeffrey, since you have just recently done a workshop on the Bay of Bengal region, would you be able to throw some thoughts at this particular specific question?
Well, Vice Admiral, you did that workshop with me, so you could also address this. But I will say that based upon my understanding, no, I do not see the Bay of Bengal as a flashpoint for direct India-China naval tensions. The IOR certainly, but I think it's going to be further west. I think you get to the Bab el-Mandeb, Red Sea, Arabian Sea meeting juncture, not only because of the transit points, the kind of port, bonanza of development going on in that region, but also the fact of the concentration of natural resource wealth that is critical for both India and China and every other actor on the world stage. The Bay of Bengal, I think, has a far more complicated, in some ways, a far more complicated kind of maritime situation than just Navy to Navy tensions, Navy to Navy rivalry. It's related to biodiversity. It's related to human migration. It's related to illicit networks. It's a headache in a multiple. It may not be as large of a headache as India-China flashpoints, but it is an endless series of headaches that could possibly drive you mad.
Right, and Abhijit, do you want to say something?
I just got two fingers. I agree with Jeff that I don't think we're going to see conflict in the Bay of Bengal, but I say that we have to be wary of the Chinese strategy in the Bay of Bengal, because as as I mentioned earlier, China does not have that full spectrum dominant strategy that it uses in the South China Sea. It doesn't use that same strategy in the Bay of Bengal. Here, it's more incremental stakeholdership. So this is really a salami slicing of Indian influence. They're going to be there in this region. They're not going to operate in any waters that are critical for India's national interests. Meaning, it's not going to be Indian territorial waters. They're not going to be hanging around anywhere near the Andamans. They're going to send non-military ships. That's what they're going to do. And that's what they have been doing: survey ships, research vessels, fishing vessels. They're going to be investing in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. So I come back to the same point. Military strategy won't cut it in the Bay of Bengal. We need a counter-composite strategy. And with the US and other partners, we need to think of that. And on Russia, if I can just add to what the Admiral said, we did a bilateral with Russia and the ORF just a couple of days back. Exactly this question came back. My sense is the Russians are extremely skeptical of the Indo-Pacific strategy. They think that the NATO is, that the Quad is an Asian NATO. And, the Russian Foreign Minister, Mr. Lavrov, has said so much, and a number of Russian academics and scholars are now writing about it to say that India's got to be wary about what it's getting into. So I think until we don't sort our differences out there, we're not going to see too much movement on that logistics agreement that we've said we'll sign up with them. But that's all. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. And it's also, I also want to make a comment about the Russian IP before I turn to Satu once again. And that is that, the Russia, Indo-Pacific, the Russia, shall we say, reluctance to embrace the Indo-Pacific as a concept, and their panic that what will happen to Asia-Pacific and continental power. But actually, perhaps you might want to think about whether there is another power play going on between Caucasian Russia centered in Moscow and Eastern Russia centered in Vladivostok. And Caucasian Russia centered in Moscow is extraordinarily reluctant, but understandably so historically, to actually cede economic power to Vladivostok. And they're not seeing the fact that they're not seeing the writing on the wall that, look, in terms of energy trade, it is Vladivostok which will call the shots in the future. And as the Russian Arctic melt occurs, Vladivostok's stock will rise. And Russia must resolve this internally. I think that, to my mind at least, there is some degree of this power play internal to Russia, which drives some of their comments right now being made about the Indo-Pacific. Sooner rather than later, Russia will swing around, because economics will drive it to that. And so, Satu, I have one question for you, and we haven't talked about this at all. So that is to do with Quad Plus and whether our interests, all our interests of the Quad nations, as well as specifically the United States, Australia, India, and Japan, so that brings me back to the Quad nations, actually converge, have a confluence in Indonesia. From my perspective as a naval admiral, I certainly feel very, very strongly that the one country, God gave in the Cold War, God gave the NATO powers, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, the Duke. And God has given us Bombay Weta. and all nuclear-powered submarines must transit this one strait. So why aren't we looking at every Indonesian and asking the first question being, I'll marry you, and then worrying about his gender later on? It's that important to us, Satu.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, Vice Admiral. I appreciate it, the opportunity. Look, let me say a couple things on Russia from an American perspective first, okay, before getting to Indonesia, because that stream was very interesting in the Indo-Pacific. We've talked a lot about Russia in the context of the Indo-Pacific. You'll hear very little of that conversation in the United States about Russia's role, except in three ways. One, is the Russia-China relationship truly strengthening or not? Second, is there really a fundamental, there is certainly a fundamental difference between the view in the Pacific, Russia, Vladivostok, and I've been out there, visited the Pacific Fleet before, and Moscow on Asia policy. And even if there is a difference, which I believe there is, doesn't matter because Moscow is calling the shots. And third is just how much will Russia enter either with or without coordination with China to muck up the picture in the Indo-Pacific through arms sales, energy sales, and what have you in the East Asia region. If you talk to our Japanese friends, they're very mindful of Russia's continuing differences on the Northern Islands, and they will want to calibrate that. There are arguments here and there throughout East Asia that the Russia factor could be useful, whether it's on North Korea or vis-a-vis China. So the picture is a little bit more complicated, I think. On Indonesia, look, there has been recently a stir on Indonesia issues in Washington, primarily because of the visit of the Defense Minister, Mr. Prabowo, to Washington last month. And secondly, because of China's increasing bellicosity towards Indonesia regarding the Northern Natuna and the Natuna Sea. Does that move Indonesia? I do not know. Short answer, I do not know. I think Indonesia, if I may say, has a strong DNA, like India, for a omnidirectional, strategic autonomy, non-alignment, what they call in their constitution, a free and active foreign policy. I do not foresee Indonesia will want to jump on one side or another, but we can empirically verify the following four things. One, Indonesia seeks much closer relations with Washington. Two, Indonesia seeks much closer relations and has achieved them to some extent with India. Three, Japan pays much more attention to Indonesia, and relations between Japan and Indonesia have improved. Please witness the sale of frigates by Japan to Indonesia, for example. Four, Australia is a critical player. It goes hot and cold between Canberra and Jakarta. It's a very complex, complicated, proximate relationship. But in my view, if you look at those four bilateral trends of the four Quad players with Indonesia, the trend line is generally upward. But I would caution against, I think Deepa put it nicely on the Quad, overselling Quad. I think one should be, cautious and not try to back up Indonesia into a space where they have to dock on to Quad rather than their preference, I think, which would be to deal with each of these players on their own terms in their own complicated ways. And I think there's much bandwidth to do so given the changing dynamics of Indonesia's place in the region and with the regional players. So thank you very much for that opportunity to address.
And we have just about 5 minutes left, and maybe one question across to Dr. Aparna Pande once again. By the way, that's a great backdrop. And that question is quite sharp. And it says this, that is it not foolhardy to ignore US duplicity? And that's a pretty strong word, vis-a-vis Pakistan, for India to be an all-weather loyal strategic partner of the US. And I want to add one comment of my own, which I hope you'll be able to bring into your response. And that is that, we just finished a review of the various European countries' strategies in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly that of France and Germany. And while I have no quarrel with anything that France is projecting, and all of you have agreed, but Germany, in one area of its identified partners, has identified in the area of non-proliferation its partner of choice as being China. And I said, wow, what have you guys been smoking? So what is your view? Because both these are linked questions, whether China has first messed up the situation in terms of proliferation, and whether the USA is actually duplicitous in its dealings with Pakistan. And I have tried not to downplay the word, although I appreciate that it's probably undiplomatic.
Thank you, Vice Admiral. Actually, I would say they sort of, if we have to discuss US-Pakistan relations, there are grievances on both sides, and a lot more on the side of the Americans than they are on the side of Pakistan, because the Americans could turn around and say Pakistan has been duplicitous and has not really abided by any of the agreements that Pakistan signed with the US, including the question which you brought up about proliferation, which is of nuclear proliferation. And the AQ Khan network. But leaving that aside, I mean, US during the Cold War had a relationship with Pakistan. India did not want to be part of any bloc. And so we stayed out of it. Today, it's a different world. It's different. I mean, geopolitics changes. Interests remain the same, right? I mean, there are no abiding friends. What is abiding is national interest. And so sort of, what India needs to decide is where its national interests lie, with whom those national interests lie, and whatever relationship that country may have had with somebody else should not necessarily define India's relationship with that country. So India's relations with US are based on Indian national interests. The extent to which India goes will be framed by India and by the United States. Will Pakistan be a factor in it? Yes, because for India, its South Asian neighbors are critical to its security. So US relations with Pakistan, India's relations with Pakistan, Afghanistan will all play into it. But I believe it should be decided by India, not based on, sort of anything sentimental which may have arisen from the past. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm afraid that although I would have loved to continue this discussion, and I'm sure our audience would have as well, but we have another stellar bunch of luminaries waiting to push us out. So we are unfortunately clean out of time. And Dr. Jaiswal has sent me a number of, very polite, would you like to catch the bus now or 5 minutes ago? So, kind of comments. And I just wanted to thank you once again to each and every one of our panelists for their brilliant overviews, and even more so for their incisive and yet succinct responses to the many hard questions. I also want to say thank you to the audience for agreeing with me that we need to ask experts questions that are worthy of their expertise. And I think that the audience has done that, and the experts on our panel have certainly demonstrated uncommon expertise in dealing with them. I'm very happy that you haven't pulled any punches. I'm very happy that we agreed to drop our diplomatic hats, leave them outside the door, and yet not enter into any excessive belligerency about any of the subjects we spoke about. Thank you for your frankness. Thank you for your comprehensiveness, and thank you for your expertise. Thank you very much, Dr. Jaiswal. I'm going to turn it across back to you, but I would request all our members of the audience to, these 6 gentlemen and ladies deserve a big hand, but I'm sure they'll settle for 2 small ones clapping like mad. Thank you very much. Pramod, it's over to you.
Distinguished Chair, Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express a sincere gratitude and thanks to the Chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.